Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to crash course into civil procedure.
That's right. We're going to break it all down, make it clear and engaging for you.
All right.
We'll hit the why behind all the rules, and then connect everything back to the big picture of the legal system.
All right, so let's dive in.
Yeah.
First up, we got to understand the playing field.
Okay.
The federal court system.
Yeah.
Can you give us a quick overview?
It's kind of structured like a pyramid.
Okay.
At the top,
All right.
we've got the Supreme Court, highest court in the land.
Right.
Below that, we have the courts of appeal,
Okay.
which review decisions from those lower courts. And then at the base of the pyramid, we have the district courts.
Okay.
That's where the trials happen. Cases are initially filed and heard.
So that's where the action begins.
That's where it all starts.
But how do we even know
Yeah.
if a case even belongs in federal court in the first place?
That's where subject matter jurisdiction comes in.
Okay.
It's the court's power to hear a specific type of case.
All right.
So think of it as like their ticket
Okay.
to even consider a case.
Okay, so subject matter jurisdiction is like the gatekeeper.
Yes.
Making sure that the federal courts
Exactly.
are only handling cases that they're authorized to.
That's right.
What are some examples of cases that would fall under federal court jurisdiction?
So two of the most common types are federal question and diversity of citizenship.
Okay.
So federal question jurisdiction means the case involves a question of federal law,
Gotcha.
like a dispute over a federal statute or constitutional right.
Okay.
Now, diversity jurisdiction.
That kicks in when you've got parties that are citizens of different states.
Okay.
And the amount of money at stake is over $75,000.
Okay. So why would a case between people from different states end up in federal court? Wouldn't it make more sense to have it in one of their home states?
So historically, there were concerns about potential bias if a case was heard in a state court
Okay.
where one of the parties was from.
Right.
So let's say you've got a Texan suing a Californian in Texas state court.
Yeah.
You know, there might be a perception that the Texan would have a home court advantage.
One crucial rule is this idea of complete diversity.
Okay.
What that means is that no plaintiff can be from the same state as any defendant.
Okay.
So, for example, if you've got a Texan suing a Californian,
Right.
boom, we've got diversity.
Okay.
But if that Texan also sues another Texan, we lose complete diversity.
Okay.
And that lawsuit would likely need to be filed in state court.
So it's an all or nothing deal.
Pretty much, yeah.
No exception.
Courts have generally taken a really strict approach to complete diversity.
Okay.
And this was really solidified in a Supreme Court case called Strawbridge v. Curtis,
Okay.
which established that all plaintiffs must be from different states than all defendants
Okay.
for a federal court to have diversity jurisdiction.
Gotcha. So how does the court determine a person's state citizenship
Yeah.
for diversity purposes? Is it simply based on where they live?
It's a little more nuanced than that. It's not just about physical residence.
Okay.
It comes down to something called domicile.
Domicile.
Yeah, domicile is a legal term
Okay.
for your permanent home.
Right.
The place where you intend to remain indefinitely.
Mm-hmm.
So for diversity purposes, a person is considered a citizen of their state of domicile.
Hold on a minute. Domicile.
Yeah.
This seems tricky.
Yeah.
What about someone who moves frequently,
Right.
like a student?
Yes. This is a great example.
How does domicile apply to them?
So the textbook explains that a person keeps their old domicile until they establish a new one.
Okay.
And to establish a new domicile, you need two things: physical presence in the new state
Okay.
and the intent to make it your permanent home.
Right.
So, for example, a student living in a different state for school,
Yeah.
they wouldn't be considered domiciled there because it's temporary.
Gotcha.
Their domicile would likely remain their home state, even though they're living somewhere else for school.
So for our hypothetical law student
Yes.
packing up, heading to law school,
Exactly.
doesn't change their state citizenship
No.
for diversity jurisdiction.
That's right.
Interesting. Now,
Yeah.
let's shift gears a little bit
Okay.
and tackle another concept,
Right.
personal jurisdiction.
Personal jurisdiction.
And what is this all about?
So think of it as the court's power over the defendant.
Okay.
It's the authority to make the defendant show up
Right.
and defend themselves in a specific court. So essentially it's about fairness,
Okay.
making sure it's reasonable for a defendant to travel to a certain state to fight a lawsuit.
Got it. So personal jurisdiction determines
Yeah.
whether a court has the power to make a decision
Right.
that affects this particular defendant.
That's right.
How does a court establish this?
So this is a journey through legal history.
Okay.
In the early days, it was all about physical presence.
Okay.
If you were served with a lawsuit while you were physically in a state,
Yep.
that state's courts had jurisdiction over you.
Yep.
And a classic case from this era is Pennoyer v. Neff.
Mm-hmm.
The court in that case couldn't exercise jurisdiction over someone who wasn't physically present in the state.
That seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
So why did they move away from this?
Well, as our world became more interconnected,
Okay.
the Supreme Court recognized that simply relying on physical presence wasn't enough.
Okay.
So in this landmark case,
Yeah.
International Schuko v. Washington,
Okay.
they introduced the minimum contacts test.
Okay.
And this test focuses on whether the defendant has sufficient connections with the state, regardless of whether they were physically present when the lawsuit was served.
So instead of looking at where the defendant is physically located when they're served,
Exactly.
the court now considers their overall connection to the state.
That's right.
This minimum contacts test
Yeah, this is big.
sounds pretty important
Oh, it is super
for
important.
lawyers to understand.
International Shoe was a game changer.
Okay.
It really shifted the focus from physical presence. Mm-hmm.
To the defendant's deliberate actions and relationship to the state where the lawsuit is filed.
Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit.
Yeah.
What does it mean for a defendant to have sufficient connection with a state?
Well, the Supreme Court has developed a two-part test for this.
Okay.
It's purposeful availment
Okay.
and fair play and substantial justice.
Those sound like pretty high-level legal concepts.
They are.
Can you give us a real-world example of this?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say we have a company based in California
Okay.
that sells products online.
Okay.
If they are actively marketing those products to customers in New York,
Yeah.
processing orders from New York, and regularly shipping goods to New York,
Right.
they have purposefully availed themselves of the privilege of doing business in New York.
Okay.
They've intentionally directed their business activities toward New York,
Gotcha.
establishing a connection with the state.
Okay, so a New York court would probably find that the company has minimum contacts.
With New York, even though the company's based in California.
Exactly.
Gotcha. So purposeful availment means
Yeah.
that they're not just randomly connected to New York. They've
Right.
intentionally engaged with the state
That's right.
through their business activities.
Exactly.
Okay, what about fair play and substantial justice?
Yeah, that's an important safeguard.
Okay.
So even if a defendant has those minimum contacts,
yeah.
the court still has to consider whether it's fair and reasonable to make them travel to that state to defend the lawsuit.
So fairness seems kind of subjective.
It can be tricky.
Yeah. How do courts actually determine what's fair in these types of situations?
So courts consider a lot of factors.
Okay.
For example, they look at the burden on the defendant.
Okay.
Would it be incredibly inconvenient or expensive for them to travel to the state?
Okay.
They also consider the interests of the plaintiff
Okay.
in having the case heard in their chosen state.
Right.
And finally, the court examines the interests of the state where the lawsuit was filed.
Okay.
Does that state have a legitimate interest in resolving the dispute?
So it's a balancing act.
Exactly.
Weighing the interests of all the parties involved.
That's right.
And making sure it's fair
Yeah.
to drag the defendant into court in a particular state.
Exactly, to illustrate this balancing act.
Okay.
Let's look at this famous case, worldwide Volkswagen Court v. Woodson.
Okay.
In this case, a family bought a car in New York.
Okay.
Later, while driving through Oklahoma,
Oh.
they were in a terrible accident.
Okay.
Tragically, the car burst into flames, injuring the family.
Oh, wow.
They sued the car dealer and distributor in Oklahoma,
Okay.
but the Supreme Court ultimately said that Oklahoma couldn't exercise jurisdiction over the New York defendant.
Why not? The accident happened in Oklahoma.
You would think so, right?
Yeah.
That's what the family argued.
Yeah.
But the Supreme Court emphasized that the dealer and distributor had no other connections to Oklahoma.
Oh.
They didn't sell cars there. They didn't advertise there.
Yeah.
They had no business operations in the state.
Okay.
The fact that the car ended up in Oklahoma was purely coincidental.
Oh, wow.
It wasn't because of anything the dealer or distributor did.
Gotcha.
So the court concluded that it would be unfair to make the New York defendants travel all the way to Oklahoma to defend the case.
So even though it happened there,
Right.
the court found it wasn't fair to make them travel.
Yeah, and the court really emphasized that Oklahoma didn't have a strong enough interest in the case to justify exercising jurisdiction, especially given the burden it would impose on the defendants.
This is definitely more nuanced than just serving someone with a lawsuit while they're passing through a state.
Exactly.
It seems like this could be a real battleground for lawyers.
It is.
With plaintiffs trying to establish those connections to a particular state and defendants trying to minimize them.
Exactly. It's all about strategy.
It sounds like, this deep dive is giving me a much deeper understanding of civil procedure than just reading the textbook.
Awesome.
We've covered subject matter jurisdiction, different types of federal courts, personal jurisdiction.
Right.
Where do we go from here?
So now that we've explored whether a court can even hear a case, let's move on to the next big question. How does the defendant even find out they're being sued in the first place? That's where service of process comes in. It's all about fairness and due process. Imagine being sued but having no idea because you were never properly notified. That wouldn't be a fair system.
Right.
So service of process makes sure the defendant gets proper notice of the lawsuit and has a chance to respond.